Our first keynote speaker today is Ben Thomas. He is the Senior Policy Director for Agriculture for the Environmental Defense Fund. And there he works to create innovative and pragmatic solutions to address environmental risk.
Thank you for that introduction. And I think good to go on audio. Just put something in the chat box if my mic is not coming through okay. Thank you, Lori, for that introduction. And I know this is your first virtual event, but your team has done a remarkable job pulling this together. I know that's no easy task to coordinate everyone remotely. So thanks to them and you for your hard work and success in pulling this together. And I really am excited to speak to this group today. As you heard my background, I grew up on a farm in the Texas Panhandle, just west of Lubbock. It's a cotton and peanut farm, although we're diversified and willing to grow whatever crop can survive the occasional hailstorm and a good sandblasting every few weeks. But my skill set growing up was never quite up to the task with staying on the farm in hopes of taking over. So after a short time spent back at the farm after college, I left for law school with the idea of moving on from agriculture. Of course, it never works out quite like that. My entire career has been in ag policy from Arkansas to DC to Montana. And I never dreamed I'd find the right opportunity to be engaged on these issues that I love at the federal level, but still have the chance to move back to Texas to be close to family. And this is actually my first kind of public engagement, if we'll call it that, with Texans as a Texan, and I really do appreciate it. Going back to my past career a bit, I viewed every opportunity I had from the perspective of how I could be most effective with my experience and education to improve the life of the family farmer in America. At the time, that meant on focusing on things like crop insurance or addressing barriers to trade. That approach served me well. I found the right opportunities, but eventually I was offered the top job in Montana, the Department of Agriculture, and I really was excited to get out of the Beltway and get out where the work was being done. And in the end, that shift from DC to Montana was not just geographic and political, it ended up being a shift in my priorities. My first summer in Montana was drier than average by quite a bit. Beetle kill left spots of dead wood in the forests, and the dry pastures had this kind of dry, foreboding energy about them, if you can understand what that means. And sure enough, 1.4 million acres burned in Montana that year, the most on record. Bizarrely, that quickly moved into a worse than average winter. And after that, a drought that was worse than the previous year, thankfully without the fire. And then that following winter, 2018 to 19, was one of the most extreme on weather in both intensity and duration. And although snowpack was appreciated, that late thaw kept too many farmers out of the field, and many of them ended up being thankful because unseasonal rains in the fall kept more than a few from a harvest. Now, these weather challenges are no stranger to any farmer, but my experience in those first few years of the extremes of weather conditions and the impact it has on not just farmers, but the rural economies made me finally come to accept that climate change is not just an issue we need to be thinking proactively about. It should be a priority for our public policy to address, to mitigate, and to provide adaptive solutions for, especially when it puts our food supply system at risk. And it goes beyond my expertise, and I won't spend time on the science of it and the increase in temperature we've experienced in recent years, and that we increase in the future if we don't draw down those greenhouse gases. But I do know that failure to take action will not just add risk to farming, it'll represent a missed opportunity to provide pathways for our farmers and ranchers to be a part of the strategy to mitigate and to make sure that the worst never has to come to be at all. Thankfully, working in this space now, the conversation has just shifted drastically. Just a few years ago, when I was seeking confirmation before the Montana Senate, I remember actually striking out the words climate change from my speech and writing extreme weather or something like that. It was just too controversial. Just a few years later, there is a bipartisan call for action, and within that, a bipartisan recognition of the opportunity here. And that's why I'm here to discuss quickly. I'm very grateful to be EDF, as others might agree. It isn't always easy working for environmental NGOs. Sometimes people just assume the worst, and skeptics too often start what could be a meaningful dialogue with a false premise or a baked-in conclusion. But my approach to this task has been the same approach I've always taken, which is to fight like the family farm is at stake, because in a way it is. And speaking of the farm, when I was young, I was always taught to work your hardest, but to not be afraid to ask a neighbor for help. And the same mindset applies here. That's why EDF initiated the Food and Ag Climate Alliance, or FACA as we refer to it. FACA is an alliance of farmers, forest owners, the food sector, state governments, and environmental advocates who set out last year with the goal of coming to consensus on policy recommendations to address climate change. No doubt it's an unlikely group. It includes some heavy hitters who can sometimes be found hitting each other, like Farm Bureau and Farmers Union. Several commodity groups joined as well, including corn, milk, and beef. And we've recently added the public land grant universities and the Farm Credit Administration, to name a few. I joined EDF late in the game, so I can't take credit for building that coalition, nor can I speak to how confident the initial members were that they could actually agree on anything except the color of the sky. But I can certainly recognize the tenacity behind their intentions. But in late 2020, they successfully released the first draft recommendations to Congress and the public. There were, I think, 27 specific recommendations, and they were around 4 core concepts. First, study crop insurance and soil health practices and the interaction between the two. Second, we need to build capacity for soil health strategies at the state level. Third, we need to look at changes to NRCS to enhance their work on greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation. And fourth, we support a menu of voluntary policy options to encourage reducing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through a USDA-led Commodity Credit Corporation carbon bank. A lot to unpack there, and I'll do that in short order. Of the rest, probably not new ideas, and they really speak for themselves. I'll note that EDF has a preference for relying on voluntary incentive-based pathways to encourage climate-smart agriculture. This sometimes requires investment of public funds, but these approaches are much more likely to succeed politically and to be timely implemented and broadly adopted. All of this in a context where we really don't have much more time to waste. And I really want to drill in on this fourth point here, which is supporting private markets with a carbon bank. What does that really mean? I know the nature of this gathering, there's a much higher level of knowledge about the emerging carbon markets, and it's much higher than the general public. And probably there's also a wide range of views on that, ranging from distrust to hope, and probably a lot in between. This isn't really new ground here, just kind of shaky ground. And I'll just leave it at that very high level and frame it as governments worldwide have enacted laws to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases, there are frameworks that allow the large emitters to pay others to reduce their emissions or sequester carbon, either because it's cheaper than doing it themselves, or because it simply takes time to transition their operations or their economies to meet the established targets. There's a lot to unpack in there, but again, just leave it at that higher level for now. My interest in this is probably clear. As this develops, the large emitters like power plants and industry might have an interest in paying farmers for their activities. To me, that means an additional revenue stream. To others, that means another avenue to draw down greenhouse gases, and one that may include co-benefits to rural communities, wildlife, soil health, or many other things. And certainly carbon sequestration has been the focus of this, and there are reasons for that. And while there may be a great deal of potential in sequestering carbon in our vast amount of ag lands, how that actually pans out, it will vary from farm to farm. So I think it's important to emphasize that other gases are included in this, such as nitrogen from fertilizer or methane from livestock. What excites me in these areas is that we've been doing a ton of work with producers and dairies on approaches that can be effective here that don't just provide the opportunity to latch on to those additional revenue streams, but also come with other financial benefits. We've seen decreased input costs from optimizing the nitrogen balance, or additional revenue streams from including biogas with livestock operations. Now, the US has, of course, largely avoided or deferred that strict regulatory approach other countries have taken. Some states have, though. California is one with kind of mixed levels of success. And I know some other states are looking into it as well. But now we've seen private entities jumping into the game, either believing that the US might eventually take a more regulated approach, or that the voluntary markets will find more stability and more viability on their own. So in this state of play, FACA recommended a role at USDA for supporting these developing markets. And as co-chair of the Carbon Bank Working Group, it's my task to figure out how to do that. And we're in the middle of that right now, hoping to come to consensus in the next 2 weeks. So our kind of comprehensive fact-finding mission on this started in January. And along the way, I'll say each FACA member probably had a view of what we set out to do that was different, in some cases significantly different than other FACA members. And I would say we all evolved quite a bit as we came to realize how very little we knew in this space. But I really do think we are quickly approaching consensus here. I can't speak specifically to what our recommendations will look like because we're not there yet. But we have identified a few principles that have kind of risen to the top. First, with credit to the innovators out there who have developed these protocols and these markets, this is an area with so many unknowns and a lot of unanswered questions. If we want this to take off, we really need a comprehensive strategy to understanding the various protocols, maybe even connecting them in a sense, so that we can maintain the confidence of both the producers that we want to participate and the potential buyers that we want to come in and participate in the market. And we want them to have confidence that they do represent a drawdown, ideally permanent, but that's complicated, of greenhouse gases. Some level of consistency is important here. And just as important as that consistency is that the consistency does not undermine the science. All that being said, our intentions here are to support the private markets, not to displace or undermine them. Second, just to ride on President Biden's buzz around infrastructure, in order for us to achieve our very bold goals, we must envision what critical climate infrastructure is or should be and invest in it. I certainly can't take on defining what that is right now, but we are thinking very broadly to include research capacity, as well as capacity for technical assistance to teach others how to take on new approaches or adopt new technologies. Thirdly, and I view this as a noble goal, both in its own right, but also as something that will broaden support and overcome political or ideological opposition, we must think broadly and inclusively about how to develop and deploy all of this. That's no easy task. Ag operations vary widely, as do rural communities. But we need folks at the table as this develops, because if we keep developing transformative public policy without a robust accounting of benefits and burdens, it will lead to additional problems that may undermine our efforts entirely. So how does all of this connect to what's going on in DC? Excuse me. First, several pieces of our recommendations, including to some extent the carbon bank, they can be accomplished without legislative change through executive discretion. President Biden released a kind of all hands on deck executive order on climate change. And as part of that, USDA is soliciting feedback on how they can do more with existing authority. And we, meaning both FACA and EDF, are providing feedback consistent with our recommendations. Second, I think we'll see a number of bills in the space, some of which you'll hear about today. The first on my mind that I'd like to address is the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which is poised to be introduced this week or next, or maybe it has been today, I'm not sure. I can't go into details because I know some last minute changes were being made to put in to bring on additional co-sponsors, but the general idea is in line with this discussion, which is to allow USDA to set certain standards and allow third-party certifiers to verify compliance on a voluntary basis with the hopes of being a nexus between a USDA minimum standard and the private registries. EDF supported this bill when it was last introduced, and absent major changes, I anticipate we will support it this time as well. As a lawyer and kind of an ag policy geek, I'm tracking it out of pure interest. The drafters really took care here in considering how USDA could be used to kind of leverage the weight of the federal government in a way that's still completely voluntary, and I believe will support rather than displace folks currently in the market. I also like that it's pretty comprehensive. It includes carbon sequestration, also emissions reductions through fuel choice, livestock emissions, and energy, and deals with forests as well, which is not my expertise at all, but it's important to be included. And it also directly requires USDA to set standards on key areas that EDF believes are fundamental to the development of these markets. Specifically, the standards must speak to quantification, verifiability, additionality, and permanence. That's a whole different discussion, but the heart of this is that the standards must meet a minimum level to ensure projects are actually making a difference when it comes to reducing the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And does all that while maintaining the voluntary approach. I think is a great step forward, and it's especially noteworthy that absent a big change in direction, it will be fully bipartisan. Is this bill the whole answer? I don't know that, but I think it's a great place to start. As far as other policies, like I said, I think we'll see quite a bit of ideas generated. I think it's also worth mentioning existing Farm Bill conservation programs like EQIP, Conservation Stewardship, and CRP have proven benefits beyond climate. And many of these bills may take the approach of improving existing programs by targeting funds towards climate projects or adding climate in the ranking process. And you can imagine ways to tweak those programs to make them more effective in this space. With all that being said, I will wrap it up, and I try to leave conversations like this from a positive perspective, and really that's no challenge here. I've been through Farm Bill negotiations and certainly in heated political fights on ag policies over the years, but through FACA, I can see that we really are in a moment. And in this moment, we're unified and seeing a pathway towards addressing climate change, not through costly regulation, but by connecting folks out there who desperately want to pay producers to draw down greenhouse gases to the producers who have the land, the know-how, and the desire to do so while maintaining their productivity and continuing to support their families and rural economies. There will be disagreements on the margins on the exact approach, but I believe this is worth a hard, sincere look as one approach, and that's what I ask of all of you here today. So thank you for the time, and looking forward to hearing from everyone.
So my name is Sharon Buccino. I direct the Lands Division at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I teach public land law as an adjunct professor at the University of Wyoming. NRDC is a national nonprofit organization. We have about 3 million members and activists across the country, and we use the power of law, science, and people to protect the natural systems upon which all life depends. So while my roots are in Central Florida, my husband comes from Dallas, and we actually spent our last family vacation, that was over a year ago, pre-COVID, in the hill country surrounding Fredericksburg. I am now living in Laramie, Wyoming, but I did spend the last 30 years in what I would call the wilds of Washington, D.C. So my current work at NRDC involves many issues, but really the one I'm most excited about is the one that Lori highlighted, and that is what's come to be called 30 by 30. It's an initiative, it's gaining momentum around the world to conserve 30% of the world's lands, oceans, and inland waters by 2030. So what I'd like to do in the time that I have with you this morning is 3 things. I'd like to, I just need to get control here. Do I have control? Well, next slide. I'd like to first describe what 30 by 30 is, and then second, explain why 30 by 30 matters. And finally, just suggest a few ideas about how land trusts can contribute to 30 by 30. So, next slide. What is 30 by 30? It's a drive to protect 30% of the world's lands, oceans, and inland waters by 2030. It grew out of a global recognition that as a species, humans are destroying other forms of life at an alarming rate. Human-caused pollution and development is threatening our own species' existence. We are destroying the natural systems upon which all life depends. 5 years ago, in his book, Half Earth, renowned biologist E.O. Wilson called for setting aside half the planet in reserve. By doing so, according to Wilson, we can save the living part of the environment and achieve the stabilization that's required for our own survival. Once every decade, the international community gathers under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and they work to set new global targets to advance nature protection for the next 10 years. The 2021 meeting, which was postponed from last year of this convention, will be held in China in October. It represents one of the last best opportunities to halt biodiversity loss and put nature on a path to recovery. A growing number of scientists, it's not just scientists though, it's government leaders and activists, are calling for the parties to this convention to commit at least 30% of the global ocean and 30% of global land and inland waters by 2030. This is a bold, but it's a necessary step toward Wilson's goal, calling for giving half the earth to nature. So next slide, please. Why does 30 by 30 matter? Every 30 seconds, a football field worth of America's natural areas disappears to roads, houses, pipelines, and other development. I know this audience is fully aware of it because you're actively engaged in trying to reverse that trend. And it is by taking bold action to conserve nature that we can address several crises society faces at the same time. Conserving nature will not only enhance biodiversity, but it gets right at the challenges that Ben just articulated by helping prevent catastrophic climate change. How? Well, intact forests, for one, especially tropical forests, sequester twice as much carbon as tree farms or planted monocultures. Because 2/3 of all species on Earth are found in natural forests, maintaining intact forests is vital to prevent mass extinction. But it's not just about forests. Grasslands, wetlands, agriculture, other riparian areas all provide invaluable ecosystem services like carbon sequestration, like water filtration, like flood control. We simply cannot afford to continue to pave them over. And next slide. So what does the job to protect 30% of lands and waters look like? To ensure ecosystem protection, the protection that's necessary to avoid mass extinction and catastrophic climate change, scientists have divided the world into various ecoregions and assessed their current conditions. So the idea behind this is that we've got to make sure in conserving that we're conserving that diversity of nature that exists. And the different colors on this map, let me just explain them to you. So that dark green, those are the areas where this 30% target is now currently achieved. So these are the ecoregions where there is 30% or more currently under some kind of protected status. But then you'll see a large part of the globe is this light green, where there's high potential to reach this target. So currently less than 30% of these ecoregions is under some kind of protected status, but enough of the habitat, enough of those ecoregions remains outside of the protected areas to realistically reach that 30% goal by 2030. Now, the orange becomes a little bit more difficult. If you look at the existing habitat that remains in those ecoregions, it's about between 20 to 30%. So in those areas, some restoration is going to be needed to hit that 30% target. And then the red, and you'll see there's a decent amount of red in the United States. That's where nature is in peril, and there's less than 20% of these ecoregions, so right through the Great Plains, kind of the coastal wetlands areas, that's remaining. And so the job there is really critical, and a lot of that area has already been destroyed, and so it's critically important to preserve what we have left there. So 30 by 30, it offers tremendous opportunity for large conservation gains. We're seeing now that it's imperative to conserve at a scale and in a way that we have not done previously. And land trusts can play a critical role in that opportunity. And that's what I'd like to turn to next. Just how can land trusts contribute to this goal? To understand how land trusts might fit in, let me just start with a few words about what's happening in Washington, as Ben did so well, just in terms of connecting our conversation here to the opportunity that exists for real action right now. Ben mentioned President Biden's executive order on tackling the climate crisis. That really was one of his first actions. He issued it on January 27th. And one thing it did in that executive order was direct the Interior Department to submit a report identifying how to implement a 30 by 30 agenda. So they got 90 days to come up with that report. It's due later this month. It's most likely, it's not going to have all the answers, but it is going to lay out a process, a collaborative process to collect ideas and then move them forward into action. And what you see in President Biden's action is this recognition that we can no longer simply address emissions from power plants or cars. What we've come to understand is that how we use land has dramatic impact on greenhouse gas emissions. There was, in 2019, a critical report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change analyzed how these land uses actually do that, the ones that aren't so good and also the ones that are good. And I witnessed, even within NRDC, how this analysis really shifted how we were thinking about the challenge of climate change, because we really were focused on the power sector and emissions. And now, in part, because we have less time and there's a greater urgency, we need to be thinking about these other strategies that include the work that this audience is very much engaged in, how we are using and conserving land. Clearing and paving land, it's increased net carbon emissions, but agriculture, forestry, conservation can be part of the solutions as well. Next slide. So the what tools are available, and how can land trusts are using some of these tools? What are some of the new tools? I'm going to start with easements. This is a conservation tool, which I know many of you are familiar with. Many land trusts hold easements, conservation easements, a legally binding agreement with a landowner to keep the land in natural state. So my guess is that some of the land trusts actually own property, but others are holding these legal instruments, and those instruments give a benefit to the landowner, generally by reducing their tax burden. So I want to highlight the recent permanent authorization as well as permanent funding that has been provided to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a federal fund that does, so it's federal money, but it flows. Some of it is used for federal land acquisition and in the space of federal public lands, but a lot of that money, in fact, there's a required portion of that money that flows to the states and to local entities to be able to conserve land. And so some of that money has and can continue to be used for purchases of conservation easements or the actual outright acquisition of open space. Land trusts also provide this critical role of monitoring. So monitoring the compliance with those use restrictions. And then one thing that resonated with me and what you were saying was this need for standards. And so that brings me to the next critical tool, next slide, and that's metrics. And I think the land trusts are in a very important place to help define some of these metrics. So yes, durability is critical, but we also need to know and be able to demonstrate what really counts as conservation. And this actually, just looking through some of the news related to land trusts, having these metrics in place and being able to demonstrate the conservation value is critical to the landowners being able to rely on those tax benefits. I think it was in Colorado not that long ago where the state actually invalidated some of the easements because they could not demonstrate the ongoing conservation value. So this question of metrics is critically important. And some of the metrics are what I would call kind of traditional metrics, like water quality, how much critical habitat is preserved. But I think there are a couple of new metrics. Again, Ben flagged these and what he said. One is around equity. So how many people are being served by land trusts? The land trusts are located more often in people's backyards, really close to where people can easily access nature compared to wilderness areas. They have really important value in terms of conservation, but a lot of times they are remote and hard to get to. And so as a result, not as many and certainly not as diverse groups get to those. So that's a new metric that you might want to consider, and probably some of you already are, how you can track and demonstrate the access to nature that land trusts are providing to a diverse population. I know there's a good example of that, that at least one of the members of this group, the Green Spaces Alliance of South Texas and the Belvedere Oaks Nature Preserve within the city limits of San Antonio is an excellent example of that kind of access close to people. Another one is closer to me here, nearby in Colorado, in the city of Colorado Springs, where the Ute Valley Park, right in the middle of Colorado Springs, land that had been held by a private corporation wasn't being used anymore and came up for development. It was poised to be developed into a subdivision and various commercial units. So the Palmer Land Trust there worked with a variety of stakeholders, including the city of Colorado, to purchase that land. And it is now Ute Valley Park in the middle of the city of Colorado Springs. And then the other key metric is the amount of carbon sequestered. And I'll just offer the example of the Marin Agricultural Land Trust in California, which really over 10 years ago started to work together with farmers and ranchers to advance this concept of carbon farming, which gets to the idea of carbon banks. And then last slide, funding mechanisms. I mentioned the Land and Water Conservation Fund. A couple of other thoughts on funding. We're seeing corporations getting much more actively involved in the conservation of open space and communities. Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas is a great example of that, contributing actively to the creation of trails and open space. There, Intel has now moved in to West Virginia and is doing the same thing there. I'd also like to flag the creative use of state funds because I think because of climate change, we may see there's a lot of money in the Land and Conservation Fund right now, but most of that money comes from oil and gas revenues from drilling offshore. And at least looking out into the future, we've got to move in a different direction. So that stream of revenue will decrease. So what are some other sources of revenue? Well, Colorado offers a good example where they are drawing on lottery funds through the Great Outdoors Colorado program to actively and aggressively fund new conservation. Ben mentioned the Farm Bill programs, which we absolutely need to continue to support. One thing that's important, though, is those programs, like the Environmental Quality Improvement Program, EQIP, and the Conservation Reserve Program, they've been traditionally focused on a certain kind of agriculture and a certain kind of farmer, primarily in the Midwest. And so Western landowners, a diversity of landowners who may be holding pasture land that they're not really actively growing crops, we need to figure out a way to get more of the Farm Bill funding to a larger, more diverse group of landowners. So in conclusion, 30 by 30 is an important step in the right direction. But it isn't enough. We actually need 40 by 40 and then 50 by 50 to get to what E.O. Wilson has so compellingly articulated in his idea of half Earth. But land trusts play a critical role in helping us get there. So it's wonderful to have the chance to talk with you all. Thank you.
Is my audio good? Good. Sorry, I had to switch to my wired headset. But I received a signed copy from E.O. Wilson personally, along with a letter, and that's a whole nother story. But yeah, he's an amazing person. And the idea of half Earth is not that half of the Earth will be preserved completely in nature, but that we work with private landowners and agricultural producers and all of these entities to get to that point where our wildlands and wildlife and wild spaces have a chance to succeed. So I want a couple of questions for you. If maybe we could switch back to the map slide. Someone's asking, Sharon, why so much of the northern Arctic is red in that protected area section. Is that because of mining or I mean, there's not a lot of people up there, right? So what's going on up there?
Yeah, I think it's not as much the extraction. There is a fair amount of extraction further over in Alaska. And of course, we continue to fight over whether we should have drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That red is really primarily, I think it's climate change. It's the loss of those habitats, which are very fragile ecosystems as the climate is changing, as the ice is melting. So not as much the result of human activity, but still clearly a consequence that we have to deal with and try to address.
Thank you. So Ben, somebody is asking about, how we can fully capitalize on the opportunity for leveraging carbon sequestration markets in parts of Texas that have sort of limited soil, really rocky soils, like the hill country. Do you have any thoughts on that specifically?
That's difficult for sure. And I would just point to making sure that you're looking beyond just carbon. Think methane and nitrogen. If you're a livestock operation, that may be an opportunity. Technologies are relevant. Some soil applications can unlock new potential, and certainly renewable energy projects can come into play. But the reality is that 1 acre of ag land is not equal to any other acre of ag land. Just as one may not be more productive in agriculture, it may not whether it's access to water or soil quality, it may also not be equal for the purpose of a carbon sequestration payment. But to that same extent, going in with that knowledge and expectation that the support might not be at exactly the same level, you may still find financial opportunity in that.
Great. This is kind of for both of you, but where do you see the important policy crossover opportunities for these issues between climate and biodiversity?
I'll go first, but I'm really interested to hear Lori's answer on this. I struggle a lot because the co-benefits here of what we're trying to accomplish with climate and how that relates to everything else that's going on in the environment, whether you're focused on wildlife or water quality or anything else, they're immense. And as we kind of move forward in this carbon market idea, there's an interest in pulling all that in together. And certainly we know that consumers care about it, right? The consumers see a value. And when we look at the private certification programs, we see an interest in not just thinking about carbon sequestration, but other environmental benefits. As far as how these policy issues interact, one thing I struggle with a little bit is this issue of additionality in the market. And for the kind of international markets to work, they require that a credit represent sequestration that's additional to other efforts. To the extent other policies might be leading to conditions that draw down greenhouse gases, that may be kind of a negative interaction between the two. But I think there's a lot comes out in implementation of these policies, and that's just to be determined.
Yeah, and Lori, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. But I think that is one of the I guess the power of this 30 by 30 idea is that it's a simple context. It's people can get their heads around it, and it is an umbrella concept in that by conserving their nature, you're doing a lot of things at once. And so, for example, in Wyoming, carbon markets and carbon sequestration may not be the ideas that capture people's imagination as much as wildlife corridors. And so it is, I look at, say, the path of the pronghorn in the western part of the state. Well, private lands were a critical piece of preserving that path of the wildlife, which required people to come together to preserve the whole path, which if one little parcel and there actually was one parcel right outside Pinedale that was the linchpin of the pressure point of the whole migration route, if that wasn't preserved, then you're losing the wildlife that's not just a critical part of the economy for the hunting, but also what people come to these places to see. So that's the path into conserving nature there, but it does then have the climate benefits that we need, even though that's not the selling point that you're using to get at that conservation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, whether you're conserving land for whatever the reason in the policy or the funding source, both of these efforts are going to be mutually benefited to some extent. Sharon, to you, someone's asking for, I want to ask a question about the 2019 IPCC report that addressed land use. And what do you think, what's the difference that effort and that report has made to to kind of initiating this national conversation about 30 by 30 here in the United States and sort of, in that global context.
Yeah. So I think it was really fundamental in shifting the conversation to bring in groups like the Land Trust to have international scientific recognition. I mean, it was from the climate scientists who said, look, we've reached the point where it might be most efficient just to look at power plants and like the emissions that are coming out of smokestacks or pipes, the tailpipes of cars, but we can't afford to just look at that anymore, and we need to be looking at the problems and the solutions that land management across the world are contributing. And so it really was transformative in the sense, it transformed the national, and I would say international conversation around climate change. I don't know whether, Ben, you would agree with that from your perspective, but that's certainly how I saw it as somebody working in the land space, directing the land division within NRDC, working very, very hard to convince my own colleagues that land was a critical part of the climate dialogue. And it was this report that really shifted that conversation, in my view.
Absolutely. So, Ben, what do you think is the appropriate level of sort of scaling up that we need to do, with our federal agricultural conservation programs in order to really move the needle on climate mitigation? I mean, these programs are some of the most tangible ones to Texas land conservation groups that we use, one of our largest sort of funding sources. So what do you, I mean, I know there's talk about doing that. What do you see as a path for this?
I think research has to be a primary component of it, and we do have kind of such an amazing set of research institutions in the United States, but we need to build on that, and we need to target more towards climate specifically. And as we build out, if we build out these market systems, there's going to be a kind of whole new workforce that's needed, that's going to go out and teach people, that's going to go out and collect the data points that we need to verify that our efforts are matching our goals, and that's going to be continuous. And so that may be NRCS, it may be through partnerships. Certainly the Growing Climate Solutions Act envisions third-party certifiers that are trained by the federal government. And then there's the larger infrastructure that's connected to all of this. It's not just research related, but how we can kind of restructure parts of our economy or our society to kind of take advantage of what's going on. So, but at this stage, I think that the science is where it's most needed.
So someone's asking, Sharon, what's the best way for local organizations and even government entities to align up with this 30 by 30 initiative? How do they get engaged at this point?
So a couple thoughts on that. One is that to follow, and it should be the end of this month, what happens with this stakeholder process that the Department of Interior will initiate as it makes its report to President Biden. They are working in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture. So the idea is that even though Interior has the responsibility for getting that done, it is an interagency effort. And then in the meantime, I do think there's a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of this large influx of funding that has come into the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I believe in Texas, it's the Texas Department of Parks and Wildlife that is the entity that funnels, that gets that federal funding and disperses it to local projects. And I'm not sure, and I think the Land Trust can really help in working with your local Parks and Recs department they're not probably even aware of all these changes that have happened federally to the fund and the opportunity. Look, I recognize it takes work to put together these projects and the proposals, but I think the land trusts can play a critical education role in making the local officials aware of the opportunity and helping them take advantage of those funds that exist.
And what about, some of the word on the street, especially in places like Texas, is critical of 30 by 30, and suggesting that, it's just really a public land grab and, blah, blah, blah. It's an effort to lock up land, excluding people from it. But, how would you respond to that? I mean, what are the counterpoints to that?
Yeah. Well, that is very much on me and groups like NRDC to educate and to be willing to talk to people who are coming at it from a different point of view. I mean, it was just a couple weeks ago that the House Natural Resources Committee had a hearing on 30 by 30 and building back better, the future of America's public. It was focused on public lands, but one of the congressmen from Idaho stated in his remarks, I can't allow this. We already have 12% of wilderness in Idaho, and now you want 28 or 18% more so that you have 30% of the state, and that's not what this is about. Yes, wilderness plays some role in 30 by 30, but the job is too big, and that's why efforts like the one that Ben articulated and talked about, where the different stakeholders are brought together to come up with solutions. 30 by 30 sets a goal. It articulates what scientists are telling us we need to do in terms of conserving nature. But then there are many pathways to achieving that goal. Some of it is through protected lands, but some of it is through policies, state and private action, funding, federal funding that can help those state and private actors. So it's really a very big tent that we need a lot of people to come under.
Right. Ben, I want to get one more question here. We're pretty much out of time, but regarding the fact of the committee that you're working on and sort of, are you guys identifying, standards and protocol that USDA might be utilizing for the funding for certification and verification?
No. I'll be really quick. I know we're out of time. No, we're not. And I don't think that's the right approach. We're not scientists. We're farm kids turned into policy geeks. I think the right approach is to find a representative committee to advise development, recognizing international standards and important national issues, but also one that uses the best available science and also generates more as we go along and uses it as well. I'm also very interested to see where the Growing Climate Solution Act falls on this. I know that includes a producer component, but also, all the other voices we need at the table.